The message arrived on a Tuesday morning at the United Earth Defense Headquarters in Geneva. It was written in 17 different languages and transmitted through channels that humanity had only recently learned to access. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the briefing room staring at the holographic display while his crew waited behind him. The message was simple and direct. The Galactic Council invited humanity to attend the annual Deathworld Summit on Kryvox Prime. Jake read it 3 times before he fully understood what it meant. Lieutenant Sophie Blake leaned forward in her chair and asked what a Deathworld was. Dr. Afwari? Peter Grant adjusted his glasses and explained that according to the galactic database they had been given access to after first contact 6 months ago, a death world was any planet with environmental conditions severe enough to challenge the evolution and survival of complex life. The galaxy rated these worlds on a scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most dangerous. Earth had been rated as a Category 6 world, though the assessment was still preliminary. Ambassador Lisa Hayes crossed her arms and pointed out that this summit only invited species from Category 3 worlds or higher. She found it interesting that humanity qualified on their first year of galactic membership. Security Officer Chris Warren, who stood near the door, made a comment about how Earth was pretty comfortable compared to what he imagined alien death worlds would be like. Medic Danny Hughes agreed and mentioned that humans had spread to almost every environment on their planet, from frozen tundras to baking deserts to the deepest ocean trenches. Jake turned to face his team and told them they had 2 weeks to prepare. The summit would last 5 days and included various challenges meant to test the survival capabilities of Death World species. He had read through the cultural briefing materials and learned that this summit was partly diplomatic gathering and partly competition. Species used it to demonstrate their strengths and form alliances with others who understood the unique perspective that came from evolving on harsh worlds. Sophie asked who else would be attending. Peter pulled up his datapad and started listing the confirmed species. The Crethans were massive beings standing nearly 3 meters tall with thick armored hides who came from a world with almost twice Earth's gravity. The Velshara were insectoid creatures with natural radiation resistance whose home planet orbited a star that regularly blasted their surface with solar flares. The Zorgothi were amphibious predators from a world covered in toxic oceans where the water could dissolve unprotected flesh in minutes. The Quintar had 6 limbs and could survive in atmospheric pressures that would crush most beings into paste. Chris whistled low and said that those aliens sounded pretty tough. Danny added that it would be interesting to see how humans stacked up against species that evolved under such extreme conditions. Lisa reminded them that this was primarily a diplomatic mission, and their goal was to make a good impression and establish relationships with other Death World species. Jake agreed, but he also knew that actions spoke louder than words, and if they wanted to be taken seriously, they would need to prove themselves during the challenges. The 2 weeks passed quickly in a blur of preparation and training. The team reviewed everything known about Kryvox Prime, which was a desert world with temperature swings of over 60 degrees between day and night. They studied the other species and their capabilities. They packed equipment that could handle multiple environmental conditions. They trained together and ran simulations of possible challenge scenarios. When departure day arrived, the team boarded a small diplomatic shuttle that would take them to the jump gate. From there, they would travel through a series of wormhole connections that spanned hundreds of light years. Jake sat in the pilot seat with Sophie as his co-pilot, while the others secured themselves in the passenger compartment. The launch was smooth and Earth fell away beneath them, a blue and white marble that suddenly seemed very small and fragile against the backdrop of space. The journey through the jump gates was disorienting, even though they had all experienced it during first contact. Space seemed to fold in on itself and twist in directions that human senses were not designed to perceive. When they emerged at Kryvox Prime, the planet filled their viewport like a giant tan and red sphere. Sophie noted that it looked a lot like Mars, but with a thicker atmosphere. Jake guided the shuttle down through the entry corridor provided by planetary traffic control. The landing pad was located near a massive complex of buildings that seemed to grow out of the desert rock itself. As the shuttle touched down and the engines powered off, Jake could see dozens of other vessels parked nearby. Some were sleek and elegant, while others were blocky and utilitarian. A few looked more like living organisms than machines. He stood and told his team it was time to meet their hosts. The airlock opened and the heat hit them like a physical force. The temperature outside was at least 40 degrees, and the air was dry enough to make their throats itch. Chris muttered that it felt like Arizona in August. Danny checked his medical scanner and confirmed the atmosphere was breathable, but recommended they stay hydrated. They walked down the ramp onto the red stone surface. A delegation waited to greet them. At the front stood High Chancellor Vexnor of the Crethan Empire. He was even larger in person than the images suggested, with dark gray armor plating covering his entire body and 4 arms folded across his massive chest. His face was angular and sharp, with eyes that glowed a faint yellow. Behind him stood representatives from several other species, all watching the humans with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism. Vexnor spoke in a deep, rumbling voice that the translation device rendered into English. He welcomed them to the Deathworld Summit and expressed his interest in meeting the newest species to be classified as Deathworld inhabitants. His tone was formal and polite, but Jake could hear the doubt underneath. The Chancellor clearly did not believe that these small, soft-looking beings belonged at a gathering of the galaxy's toughest species. Lisa stepped forward and delivered the formal greeting they had prepared. She thanked Vexnor for the invitation and expressed humanity's eagerness to learn from the other attendees. Jake watched the other aliens as Lisa spoke. Some seemed amused, while others appeared genuinely confused about why humans were present. A Velshara delegate clicked its mandibles in what their briefing materials indicated was a gesture of dismissal. Vexnor gestured toward the complex and invited them to follow. He explained that the opening ceremony would begin in 2 hours and the first challenges would start the following morning. As they walked across the landing pad toward the entrance, Jake noticed other delegates watching them. Some pointed while others turned away as if the humans were not worth their attention. Sophie moved closer to him and quietly commented that they seemed to be the smallest species present. Jake nodded and replied that they would just have to prove that size was not everything. The opening ceremony had been long and formal, with speeches from various species about the importance of understanding and cooperation between Deathworld inhabitants. Jake and his team sat through it all, making mental notes about which species seemed friendly and which ones appeared to view humans as beneath their notice. When morning came, they gathered with the other delegates at the starting point for the first challenge. Vexnor stood on a raised platform overlooking the assembled group. He explained that the first test was a tradition dating back centuries. Delegates would traverse 50 kilometers across the Kryvox Desert while carrying standard equipment packs. The route included varied terrain and would test endurance, stamina, and the ability to manage resources in extreme heat. Most species completed the march in 8 to 10 hours. The record was held by a Crethan team that finished in 7 hours and 12 minutes. The equipment packs were distributed and Jake hefted his onto his shoulders. It weighed about 20 kilograms, which was substantial, but nothing he had not trained with before. Sophie checked her pack's contents and confirmed they had water rations, navigation equipment, and emergency supplies. Chris and Danny did the same while Peter reviewed the route map on his datapad. Lisa adjusted her pack straps and said she was ready. The starting signal sounded and the delegates began moving out across the sand. The Crethans started at a steady, powerful pace, using their superior size and strength to push through the terrain. The Velshara moved in quick darting motions, their multiple legs finding purchase easily on the loose surface. The Zorgothi lumbered along, using their mass to maintain momentum. The human team settled into a comfortable jogging pace that they knew from experience they could maintain for hours. The sun climbed higher and the temperature rose steadily. By the second hour, it had reached 45 degrees and several species were showing signs of stress. The humans maintained their pace. Sophie led the group, setting a rhythm that kept them moving efficiently without burning too much energy. Jake monitored the team and noted that everyone seemed comfortable. Chris made a comment about how this felt like a training run back at Fort Benning. Danny agreed and mentioned that at least there were no drill sergeants yelling at them. By the fourth hour, the temperature had climbed above 50 degrees. Some of the other species had slowed considerably. A group of Quintar who had started strong were now moving at barely half their initial speed. The Zorgothi were struggling badly as their bodies were designed for wet environments, and the dry heat was taking a severe toll. The Velshara continued at a decent pace, but even they had slowed. The Crethans pushed forward, but their heavy armor plating was absorbing heat, and their movements had become labored. The humans increased their pace slightly. Peter explained to the others that their bodies were actually very good at managing heat. Humans could sweat, which was apparently a rare trait among galactic species. This allowed them to cool themselves efficiently, even in extreme temperatures. Sophie added that humans had evolved as persistence hunters who could chase prey for hours under the hot African sun until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. This kind of endurance running was built into their DNA. They passed several groups of struggling delegates. A Velshara clicked its mandibles in what seemed like surprise as the humans jogged past. A Crethan turned to watch them go with an expression that might have been confusion. Jake kept the team focused on the route and maintaining their pace. They stopped briefly at the designated rest points to refill water supplies, but otherwise kept moving. By the fifth hour, they could see the finish line in the distance. Sophie picked up the pace slightly, and the others matched her. They crossed the finish line at 5 hours and 47 minutes. Vexnor stood near the endpoint with a handheld device, and he looked at it twice as if confirming the reading. He asked if their timing equipment had malfunctioned. Jake assured him it had not, and that 5 hours was well within normal human capabilities for this kind of distance. The Chancellor asked where on their world humans trained in such conditions. Jake explained that Earth had multiple desert regions, including places called the Sahara Death Valley and the Outback. Some of these areas regularly saw temperatures exceeding 50 degrees. Sophie added that humans had not only adapted to live in these places, but some chose to live there permanently. Others traveled to deserts specifically for recreation and tourism. Vexnor seemed disturbed by this information, but he said nothing more. Over the next 3 hours, the rest of the delegates trickled in. The Crethans finished second at 7 hours and 8 minutes. The Velshara came in third. Several species did not complete the challenge at all and had to be retrieved by support vehicles. The human team waited at the finish area, and Lisa made a point of congratulating each group as they arrived, trying to be diplomatic despite their unexpected victory. The second challenge began that afternoon after a brief rest period. Delegates were led into a sealed chamber and told they would be exposed to various atmospheric contaminants in increasing concentrations. The goal was to withstand exposure for as long as possible. The Velshara typically excelled at this test due to their natural resistance to radiation and toxins. The test began with mild irritants that made the air smell bad but caused no real harm. The levels increased gradually. Some species began showing distress within 15 minutes as their respiratory systems struggled with the foreign compounds. The Velshara remained comfortable, appearing almost bored by the early stages. The Crethans filtered air through specialized membranes in their armor and managed reasonably well. The humans simply breathed normally. By 30 minutes, half the delegates had withdrawn from the chamber. The remaining contaminants included compounds that would cause respiratory distress, nausea, and inflammation in most species. The humans showed no signs of struggle. Danny mentioned casually that Earth's atmosphere contained all sorts of interesting things that human immune systems dealt with constantly. pollen from plants, fungal spores, industrial pollutants, volcanic gases, and countless microorganisms that most galactic species would find lethal. Peter added that human cities before the development of clean technology had air quality far worse than what they were currently breathing. He explained that places like London in the industrial era had smog so thick that people could barely see a few meters in front of them. Humans had lived and worked in those conditions for decades. Sophie pointed out that human immune systems were basically in a constant state of warfare, fighting off bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens every single day. The Velshara delegate near them turned several of its eyes toward the humans. It asked through its translator if Earth was truly that contaminated. Lisa explained that Earth had an incredibly diverse biosphere with millions of species, all producing their own chemical compounds. The planet was teeming with life, and much of that life was microscopic. Humans had evolved to survive in what was essentially a biological weapons laboratory. By 45 minutes only, the humans and 3 Velshara remained in the chamber. The contamination levels were now severe enough that they would cause permanent damage to most species within hours. At the 1 hour mark, the Velshara withdrew, not because they were failing, but because they had proven their point. The humans stayed for another 15 minutes before the test administrators declared the challenge complete and cleared the chamber. The third challenge came the next morning. Delegates entered chambers where gravitational force could be artificially increased. The test started at standard galactic gravity, which was 0.9 Earth normal, and increased in 0.1 increments. The Crethans dominated this challenge historically, as their homeworld's 1.8 gravity gave them natural superiority. The gravity increased steadily. At one point, 2 most species were struggling to remain standing. At one point, 5 several had to withdraw. The Crethans looked comfortable even at 1.7. The humans were still standing without apparent difficulty. Jake bent his knees slightly to adjust his center of gravity and settled into a stable stance. The others did the same. At 1.8, Vexnor himself entered the chamber to observe. He stood next to Jake and asked if the humans were experiencing discomfort. Jake replied honestly that it felt like wearing a heavy backpack. It was noticeable, but not particularly challenging. Chris mentioned that military training often involved carrying 30 to 40 kilogram packs over long distances. Danny added that some humans voluntarily trained with weighted vests and ankle weights to improve their strength and endurance. The gravity continued to increase. At 2.0, only the Crethans and humans remained. Vexnor watched closely as the human team maintained their positions without shaking or straining. At 2.2, the test ended as the equipment could not safely generate higher levels. The Crethans had won based on appearing more comfortable, but the humans had matched them. Sophie stretched when the gravity returned to normal and commented that it had been a good workout. As they left the chamber, Jake noticed the other delegates gathered in small groups. They were all watching the humans now with a very different look in their eyes. The evening brought a social gathering in one of the complex's large common areas. The atmosphere was less formal than the official events, and delegates mingled freely. Jake and his team found themselves the center of attention as various species approached them with questions. The humans' unexpected performance in the challenges had sparked considerable interest and curiosity. A Quintar delegate approached Danny and asked about his role in the human team. Danny explained that he was a combat medic, trained to provide emergency medical care in dangerous situations. The Quintar tilted its large head and asked what kinds of injuries Danny typically treated. Danny thought for a moment and described some of the trauma cases he had handled during his service. Gunshot wounds, blast injuries, severe burns, and catastrophic bleeding. The Quintar's skin shifted to a pale color, which their briefing materials indicated meant shock or distress. It asked what could cause such terrible injuries. Danny realized the translator was struggling with his response. He tried to explain the concept of warfare and organized combat between groups. The Quintar listened with growing horror as Danny described battles that involved thousands of combatants using weapons designed specifically to kill other humans. Other delegates nearby had stopped their own conversations to listen. Avel Shara stepped closer and asked for clarification. It wanted to know if Danny meant combat between different species. Danny shook his head and explained that no, these were conflicts between different groups of humans. Wars between nations or factions, all members of the same species, fighting each other over territory, resources, or ideology. The gathered aliens fell silent. One of the Crethans spoke up and said that such things did not happen in civilized space. Conflict between members of the same species was virtually unknown among sapient races. Territorial disputes happened occasionally between different species, but the idea of large-scale organized violence within a species was considered a sign of fundamental evolutionary failure. Species that could not cooperate with their own kind typically destroyed themselves long before achieving space travel. Lisa stepped in and tried to explain the complexity of human history. She talked about how Earth had thousands of separate cultures and nations that developed independently for most of their existence. Competition for resources and differing belief systems led to conflicts. But humanity had also learned from these conflicts and was working toward a more unified and peaceful future. The current United Earth government represented humanity's commitment to cooperation. Sophie decided to change the subject and pulled out her personal data pad. She showed the gathered aliens pictures of her family back on Earth, including images of her pets. She had a large dog that she was very proud of and a cat that slept on her bed. The pictures showed the animals playing in her yard and lounging in her home. The Zorgathi delegate made a choking sound. It pointed at the dog and asked if Sophie realized that was an apex predator. Sophie looked at the image confused and said that yes, dogs were descended from wolves, which were predators, but this was just her pet. The Zorgathi explained that it could see the forward-facing eyes, the powerful jaw, the sharp teeth, all markers of a species designed to hunt and kill. The fact that this creature lived in Sophie's home and was apparently trusted around her family was deeply disturbing. Chris laughed and said that dogs were actually quite friendly. Humans had domesticated wolves thousands of years ago and selectively bred them into hundreds of different varieties. Some were used for work like herding or security, but most were simply companions. The cat was also a predator, though much smaller. Humans kept both predator species and prey species as pets. He mentioned that some people had horses, cows, chickens, rabbits, and dozens of other animals. Peter added that humans had also domesticated their food sources. Almost everything humans ate had been modified through selective breeding over thousands of years. Wild bananas were nearly inedible until humans cultivated them. Wild cabbage was transformed into broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and several other vegetables. Even wheat and rice had been selectively bred from wild grasses. Humans had essentially re-engineered much of their planet's biology to suit their needs. Avel Shara asked about dangerous species on Earth. Peter's eyes lit up because this was his area of expertise. He started describing Earth's biodiversity, millions of species occupying every possible ecological niche, from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains. He talked about venomous snakes and spiders. He mentioned box jellyfish, whose sting could kill a human in minutes. He described saltwater crocodiles that could grow over 6 meters long and bite with a force of 16,000 newtons. The aliens listened with increasing alarm. Peter continued warming to his subject. He talked about hippos, which killed more humans in Africa than any other large animal despite being herbivores. He mentioned various species of bears and big cats that were powerful enough to kill humans with ease. He described tiny frogs whose skin contained enough poison to kill 10 adult humans. He brought up sharks and stingrays and cone snails and countless other creatures that were beautiful but deadly. Then Peter mentioned mosquitoes. The translation caused confusion because the word did not parse correctly. Peter explained that mosquitoes were tiny flying insects, barely visible, and certainly not threatening to look at. But they were the most dangerous animal on Earth, killing hundreds of thousands of humans every year by spreading diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and yellow fever. The aliens were horrified that the apex threat on Earth was an insect too small to fight. Chris started talking about human recreational activities. He described skydiving, which involved jumping out of aircraft at high altitude and falling toward the ground at terminal velocity before deploying a parachute. He mentioned mountain climbing, where humans scaled sheer rock faces hundreds or thousands of meters high with minimal safety equipment. He talked about cave diving, which combined the dangers of underwater exploration with the claustrophobic confines of underground passages. A Krethin interrupted and asked why humans would do these things. Chris shrugged and said it was fun. Humans enjoyed testing themselves against challenges. The thrill of danger and the satisfaction of overcoming it was rewarding. Jake added that humans had a saying that what does not kill you makes you stronger. Exposing oneself to controlled danger was seen as a way to build character and capability. Danny brought up extreme sports. Base jumping, where people leaped off buildings and cliffs. Free solo climbing, where people scaled mountains without any ropes or safety gear. Big wave surfing, where humans rode waves over 20 meters tall. Cave exploration marathon, running across deserts, boxing, wrestling, and mixed martial arts, where humans fought each other for sport. The list went on and on. The gathered delegates exchanged worried glances. One of them finally asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What was Earth actually rated as a death world? Peter pulled up the official Galactic Council database on his datapad. He found Earth's entry and displayed it for everyone to see. The classification read Category 9.2. Silence fell over the group. That rating was higher than any other death world represented at the summit. The Krethin homeworld was rated 7.4. The Velshara world was 8.1. Even Kryvox Prime, where they currently stood, was only rated 6.8. Earth was in a category of its own. Vexnor, who had been listening from nearby, approached the group. He studied the database entry carefully, as if looking for an error. He asked if this rating was confirmed. Lisa nodded and explained that the initial assessment had been questioned, but a follow-up survey team had verified the classification. Earth qualified as one of the most dangerous inhabited worlds in known space. The Chancellor was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that seemed obvious in retrospect. If Earth was so dangerous, how had humanity not only survived, but thrived to the point of achieving space travel? Jake looked at his team and then back at Vexnor. He said that humans did not really have a choice. Earth was their home, and they adapted to it. Generation after generation, humans learned to survive against predators, diseases, natural disasters, and countless other threats. They developed tools and technology and social structures. They competed with each other, which drove innovation even if it also caused conflict. Sophie added that humans were persistence hunters by evolution. They were not the fastest or strongest or most armored species on their planet. But they could keep going long after other creatures gave up. They could sweat to cool themselves. They could throw objects with accuracy and force. They could communicate complex ideas and work together in large groups. They could plan and strategize and adapt to changing circumstances. Most importantly, they refused to quit. Peter mentioned that human brains had developed to handle complex problem-solving. The challenges of surviving on Earth had pushed humanity to become increasingly intelligent and innovative. Every threat they faced became a puzzle to solve. How to catch faster prey, how to escape larger predators, how to survive winters without fur or hibernation, how to cross oceans and deserts and mountains. Each solution led to new capabilities and new challenges. The social gathering continued, but the mood had shifted. The other delegates no longer viewed humans as curious newcomers or potential weaklings who had been misclassified. They saw humans as something else entirely, survivors of a world that would have crushed most species before they evolved intelligence. A race that had been forged in conditions of constant danger and had emerged not just intact, but successful. Later that night, Jake stood on a balcony overlooking the desert. The twin moons of Kryvox Prime cast long shadows across the sand. Sophie joined him and commented that they had probably shared too much information. Jake agreed, but said it was better that the other species understood what humanity was capable of. The galaxy needed to know that Earth was not just another member world. Humanity brought something unique to the table, even if that uniqueness came from a place of hardship. Sophie asked if he thought the other delegates were frightened of them now. Jake considered the question carefully. He said some probably were, but others seemed more interested than afraid. The goal was not to intimidate, but to earn respect. Tomorrow, the challenges would continue, and humanity would have more opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. But more importantly, they would continue building relationships and showing that despite their harsh origins, humans valued cooperation and peace. The fourth day of the summit began with scheduled diplomatic discussions and cultural exchanges. Jake and his team were participating in a session about resource management on harsh worlds when the alarms started. Red lights flashed throughout the complex, and an automated voice announced an emergency in multiple languages. Vexnor immediately stood and moved toward the command center, with several other senior delegates following. Jake looked at his team, and they all rose to follow as well. The command center was a circular room filled with holographic displays and monitoring equipment. Technicians of various species worked frantically at their stations. Vexnor demanded a status report, and a Crethan officer explained the situation. A research station on Kryvox Prime's northern continent had suffered a catastrophic containment failure. Experimental organisms being studied there had escaped and were loose in the facility. The research staff had sealed themselves in a reinforced shelter, but life support was limited, and the organisms were attempting to breach the doors. Lisa asked what kind of organisms they were dealing with. The officer pulled up information on the main display. The creatures had been designed as an experiment in extreme adaptation. They were meant to test how quickly biological systems could evolve to handle multiple environmental stressors. The researchers had been studying accelerated evolution using computer models and controlled mutations. Something had gone wrong, and the organisms had developed far beyond their expected parameters. The display showed security footage from the research station. The organisms were roughly the size of large dogs, but their body structure was unlike anything Jake had seen. They moved on 4 legs, but could apparently reconfigure their limbs for climbing or digging. Their bodies were covered in overlapping plates that looked both flexible and durable. They had multiple sensory organs and what appeared to be both cutting and crushing mandibles. The footage showed dozens of them swarming through the station corridors. Sophie studied the images and noted that the creatures were displaying pack-hunting behavior. They were coordinating their movements and working together to overcome obstacles. Some were using their bodies as platforms for others to climb. Some were testing the strength of doors and walls systematically. These were not mindless beasts, but intelligent and adaptive predators. The officer explained that local security forces had attempted to reach the station, but been driven back. The organisms had spread beyond the facility into the surrounding terrain. The northern continent's conditions were extremely harsh, with temperatures dropping below -40 at night and thin atmosphere that required supplemental oxygen for most species. The terrain was mountainous with deep ravines and unstable rock formations. Add in hostile organisms that were specifically designed to thrive in worst-case scenarios, and the situation was nearly impossible. Vexnor stood with his forearms crossed, looking at the display with what might have been resignation. He said that a rescue attempt would be made, but he was not confident of success. The environmental conditions alone were severe, and the addition of unknown organisms with unclear capabilities made the mission extraordinarily dangerous. He asked for volunteers, knowing that few, if any, would step forward. Jake did not hesitate. He immediately volunteered his entire team. Sophie, Chris, Danny, Peter, and Lisa all indicated their agreement without needing to be asked. The other delegates stared at them. Vexnor asked if the humans understood the danger involved. Jake replied that they understood perfectly, but could not abandon people who needed help. There was always a chance of success, no matter how small, and humans did not give up while that chance existed. Several other delegates volunteered as well, perhaps shamed by the humans' immediate response, or perhaps inspired by it. 3 Crethans stepped forward, including one of the warriors who had competed in the challenges. 2 Velshara indicated they would join. A single Zorgathi also volunteered, though it looked uncertain. Vexnor himself said he would lead the mission. Within minutes, a rescue team of 15 had assembled. They equipped themselves quickly. The humans loaded their weapons with ammunition that could penetrate the organism's armor plating based on the density readings from the security footage. They put on thermal gear designed for the extreme cold. They checked their oxygen supplements and emergency medical supplies. Chris distributed spare magazines and ensured everyone knew the communication protocols. Danny packed trauma kits with enough supplies for multiple casualties. The transport vehicle was a heavy cargo hauler modified for rough terrain. It had thick armor plating and could maintain life support even in hostile environments. The team boarded and secured themselves as the pilot began the flight north. The journey would take 2 hours to cover the 800 kilometers to the research station. During the flight, Jake gathered the team to discuss strategy. They had limited information about the organism's capabilities and no time for detailed planning. The primary objectives were to reach the shelter where the researchers were trapped, evacuate them safely, and contain the organisms if possible. If containment proved impossible, they would need to eliminate enough of the creatures to create a safe corridor for extraction. Sophie pointed out that the organisms were displaying coordinated behavior, which suggested some form of communication or shared intelligence. If they could disrupt that coordination, the creatures might become less effective. Peter agreed and suggested they look for any individual that seemed to be directing the others. Taking out a leader or coordinator could create confusion among the rest. Chris discussed defensive positions and fallback points. They would need to establish a secure perimeter around the shelter entrance to cover the evacuation. The Crethans would be best suited for holding a line with their size and strength. The Velshara could provide covering fire from elevated positions. The humans would handle close combat and tactical maneuvers. The Zorgathi could assist with heavy lifting if anyone was injured. Danny reminded everyone that they had no medical data on these organisms. If anyone was injured by them, he would not know what kind of venom or pathogens they might carry. Everyone needed to avoid getting bitten or scratched if at all possible. He would do his best to treat injuries, but prevention was far better than treatment in this case. The transport began its descent toward the research station as the pilot reported visual contact. The facility was a collection of low buildings built into the side of a mountain. The architecture was designed to withstand the harsh weather with reinforced walls and minimal windows. Surrounding the buildings was a scene of destruction. The organisms had torn apart equipment and created burrows in the rocky ground. Dozens of them were visible moving around the facility. The pilot found a landing zone about 200 meters from the shelter where the researchers were trapped. The team disembarked quickly, forming a defensive formation as they moved. The temperature was -35, and the thin atmosphere made breathing difficult for most of the aliens. The humans adjusted their oxygen flow and advanced steadily. The organisms noticed them immediately. A high-pitched, shrieking sound echoed across the rocks as the creatures communicated with each other. They began converging on the rescue team from multiple directions. Jake counted at least 40 visible contacts, with likely more hidden. He ordered the team into a wedge formation, and they began moving toward the shelter. The first wave of organisms attacked from the flanks, trying to separate the group. The Crethans held the sides of the formation, using their strength and reach to knock back attackers. The Velshara fired energy weapons that burned through the creature's armor. The humans used controlled bursts from their firearms, dropping organisms with precise shots to what appeared to be vital areas. Chris called out targets and coordinated fire. Sophie moved smoothly between shooting and reloading, never wasting ammunition. Jake advanced at the front of the formation, keeping everyone moving forward. They could not afford to get pinned down in the open. Danny stayed in the center of the group, watching for injuries and ready to respond. An organism launched itself at Peter from above, having climbed onto a rock outcropping. Jake turned and fired 3 shots in quick succession, and the creature fell dead before it reached the scientist. Peter nodded his thanks and kept moving. The team pushed forward, covering the ground quickly despite the hostile terrain and constant attacks. They reached the shelter entrance, and Chris immediately began working on the sealed door, while the others formed a defensive perimeter. The organisms were massing for another attack, with dozens gathering just beyond effective weapon range. Vexnor positioned himself at the front of the line and prepared to hold against whatever came next. The door opened, and researchers began streaming out. There were 12 of them, representing 4 different species. They were terrified and exhausted, but alive. Danny quickly assessed them for injuries and found several with minor wounds, but nothing immediately life-threatening. Jake ordered them toward the transport while the team prepared to cover their retreat. That was when the organisms attacked in full force. Over 60 of them charged from all directions at once. The battle that followed would become the subject of reports and analysis throughout the Galactic Council for years to come. It was humanity's introduction to the galaxy as something more than just another spacefaring species. It was the moment when the other races truly understood what it meant to evolve on Earth. The organisms came like a living wave of teeth and claws and armored plates. They moved with terrifying coordination, splitting into groups that attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. Most species would have broken and run in the face of such overwhelming numbers. The rescue team held their ground. Jake's voice cut through the chaos with clear commands. Sophie shifted to covering the left flank where the organisms were pushing hardest. Chris moved to support the Crethans, who were taking the brunt of the frontal assault. The humans moved with a precision that shocked the alien observers. Every step, every shot, every movement was deliberate and practiced. The Velshara, who had fought in territorial skirmishes, were impressed by the humans' tactical discipline. The Crethans, who prided themselves on their warrior culture, watched in amazement as these smaller beings demonstrated combat techniques they had never conceived. Sophie called out targets and ranges while maintaining a steady rate of fire. She dropped organisms with 2 or 3 shots each, never panicking, never rushing. Her movements were fluid and efficient. Chris demonstrated something the aliens had never seen before. He was fighting multiple organisms at close range, using not just his weapon, but his entire body. He struck with his rifle butt, blocked with his armored forearm, and used his legs to maintain balance on the uneven terrain. When one creature got past his guard, he rolled with its momentum and came up firing. It was a style of combat that assumed you would be outnumbered and outmatched, but refused to accept defeat. Peter stayed near the researchers, providing covering fire and calling out organism movements from his position. His scientific mind analyzed their attack patterns in real time. He noticed that several organisms seemed to be directing the others and communicated this to Jake. If they could eliminate those coordinators, the attack might falter. Jake acknowledged and marked the targets. Danny was treating a wounded Crethan who had taken a deep gash across the arm. He worked quickly, applying pressure and sealing the wound with medical foam, even as organisms tried to flank their position. When one creature lunged at him, Danny drew his sidearm with his free hand and put 2 rounds through its skull without even looking away from his patient. The Crethan stared at him in disbelief, but Danny just told him to hold still while he finished bandaging. Lisa was helping move the researchers toward the transport. She kept them organized and calm despite the violence erupting around them. When an organism broke through the perimeter and charged at the group, Lisa stepped forward with a piece of debris and struck it hard enough to crack its armor plating. The creature recoiled, and Chris finished it with a burst from his rifle. Lisa simply turned back to the researchers and continued guiding them. Jake focused on the coordinator organisms that Peter had identified. He moved through the battle with purposeful intensity. The first coordinator was directing attacks from an elevated position. Jake dropped to one knee, aimed carefully, and fired. The organism fell, and immediately the creatures near it became disorganized. The second coordinator was harder to reach, but Sophie had a clear line of sight. Jake called the target, and she took the shot. 2 down. The third coordinator seemed to realize it was being hunted. It moved behind cover and directed organisms to screen it from the humans. Vexnor saw what was happening and bellowed a challenge that echoed across the rocks. He charged forward, using his massive strength to scatter the smaller creatures. The coordinator tried to flee, but the Chancellor caught it with one of his 4 arms and crushed it with raw power. 3 down. With their coordination disrupted, the organism's attack faltered. They were still dangerous and numerous, but they had lost their tactical advantage. The rescue team began a fighting withdrawal toward the transport. They moved in stages, with one group providing covering fire while another fell back. It was textbook military doctrine executed with practiced ease. The Velshara noticed something remarkable. The humans never left anyone behind. When the wounded Crethan struggled to keep pace, Chris and Sophie moved to support him without needing to be ordered. When a Velshara's weapon overheated and jammed, Peter provided covering fire while the alien fixed the problem. The humans fought as a unit, and they treated the entire rescue team as part of that unit. They reached the transport and began loading the researchers. Danny did a quick triage on everyone and determined that all injuries were survivable. The organisms massed for another attack, but they were more cautious now, having learned that this prey was dangerous. Chris set up a defensive position at the transport ramp and covered the final evacuation. Jake was the last aboard. He stood at the ramp with his rifle ready as the pilot powered up the engines. The organisms watched from a distance, their body language suggesting calculation rather than blind aggression. They had learned. Jake felt a strange respect for these creatures that were just trying to survive in their own way, but he could not leave them loose to threaten others. He called to Vexnor and asked if orbital weapons could sterilize the area. The Chancellor nodded grimly and said that a strike was already being prepared. It was unfortunate, but necessary. The organisms were too dangerous to contain with ground forces. Jake stepped into the transport, and the ramp closed behind him. The flight back was quiet. Everyone was processing what had happened. The wounded were stable, and the researchers were safe. The mission had succeeded, but the cost had been high in ammunition equipment and energy. More importantly, everyone on that transport had learned something about themselves and about each other. When they arrived back at the summit complex, word of the rescue had already spread. Delegates lined the landing pad as the team disembarked. The humans were covered in dust and grime, their equipment showing signs of hard use. But they walked off that transport with their heads high and their injured comrades supported between them. Over the next 2 days, the summit concluded with formal ceremonies and final discussions. But the real conversations happened in private meetings and quiet exchanges. Species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence now sought them out for discussions. The Crethans offered military training exchanges. The Velshara proposed joint research initiatives. Even the Zorgothi, who had been skeptical, expressed interest in diplomatic relations. On the final evening, Vexnor called a special assembly. He stood before the gathered delegates and spoke with unusual gravity. He stated that inviting humans to the Deathworld Summit had indeed been a mistake, but not for the reasons anyone had anticipated. Humans did not belong at this summit because they operated on an entirely different level than other Deathworld species. The Chancellor explained that he had reviewed all available data on Earth and consulted with the Galactic Council's xenobiology experts. He was formally proposing that Earth be reclassified as a Category 10 death world, the highest possible rating. Furthermore, he proposed that humanity be recognized as an apex survivor species. They were the only known sapient race to achieve technological civilization while facing constant existential threats from their own environment. The proposal sparked intense debate. Some delegates argued that no planet should be rated Category 10 as it implied conditions that would prevent the evolution of intelligence. Others pointed out that Earth clearly had produced intelligence, and that perhaps the rating scale needed to account for exceptions. After an hour of discussion, the vote was called. The proposal passed with only 2 abstentions and no opposing votes. Vexenor then addressed the humans directly. He acknowledged that the galaxy had underestimated them and that this would not happen again. He spoke of the rescue mission and the qualities humanity had demonstrated. Courage, certainly, and skill in combat without question. But also something more fundamental. A refusal to abandon those in need even at great personal risk. A commitment to protecting others that seemed built into their very nature. Jake stood to respond on behalf of humanity. He thanked the Chancellor and the assembled delegates for their recognition. He explained that humans were indeed shaped by their harsh world, but they believed that hardship could either break a species or forge it into something stronger. Earth had given humanity many gifts along with its challenges: the capacity for endurance, the creativity to solve impossible problems, the wisdom to value cooperation, and most importantly, the understanding that strength meant nothing if not used to protect others. He stated that humanity was honored to join the galactic community and looked forward to building relationships with all species present. Earth had taught humans many hard lessons, but the most important was this. The most dangerous thing in any environment was not the conditions or the predators. It was underestimating what someone would do to protect the people they cared about. Humans cared about their team, their allies, and their friends. The galaxy could count on that. The delegates responded with various gestures of respect and approval. Over the following weeks, as the attendees returned to their homeworlds, they carried with them stories of the Death World Summit and the humans who had exceeded all expectations. The term Death Worlder became a common galactic phrase, but when someone wanted to emphasize extraordinary danger or capability, they used a new term. They called it human level. The Galactic Council updated its threat assessment protocols and created a new category above all others. It was designated for only one planet and one species. Category Human, with a notation that extreme caution was advised, not because humans were hostile, but because their capabilities were far beyond what their appearance suggested. The following year, the Death World Summit was renamed the Survival Species Conference. Humans were invited as honored guests and keynote speakers. Jake and his team returned, and this time they were greeted not with skepticism, but with genuine respect. They shared their knowledge freely, teaching other species about endurance training, tactical coordination, and emergency medicine. But the real lesson had already been learned. The galaxy had invited humans to prove they belonged among the toughest species in known space. Instead, humans had proven that Earth had prepared them for challenges that other species could barely imagine. They had not come to compete with other Death World inhabitants. They had come to show what was possible when a species refused to give up no matter what their world threw at them. Sophie stood on the same balcony where she and Jake had talked during the first summit. The desert stretched out before her peaceful under the light of the twin moons. She thought about how much had changed in 1 year. Humanity had gone from being unknown newcomers to being recognized as something unique in the galaxy. It was a heavy responsibility, but she believed humans were ready for it. Jake joined her, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. He finally spoke and said that Earth had given them an unusual gift. It had made them strong in ways they had not fully appreciated until they met species from gentler worlds. But strength without purpose was meaningless. Humanity's real contribution to the galaxy would not be their endurance or combat skills. It would be their determination to use those gifts to help others. Sophie agreed and added that maybe that was the most important lesson Earth had taught them. Surviving was not enough. You had to survive for something. You had to build and protect and create. You had to care about more than just yourself. That was what separated humans from the organisms at the research station. Both were survivors, but only one chose to use their survival to make things better for others. They returned inside where the rest of their team waited. Tomorrow they would begin the journey home to Earth. They would report on everything they had learned and experienced. They would help prepare humanity for its growing role in galactic affairs. It would be challenging work, but Jake and his team had learned long ago that challenges were just opportunities in disguise. Somewhere back on Earth, in the cities and deserts and forests and oceans, humanity continued its daily existence. They did not yet know that their world had been reclassified or that their species had earned a reputation across the stars. They simply lived their lives facing whatever challenges came with the same stubborn determination that had carried them from caves to skyscrapers to the stars themselves. And in the wider galaxy, thousands of species were learning a new truth. Earth had invited humans to evolve in the harshest conditions, and humanity had accepted that invitation. Now humanity was inviting the galaxy to learn from them. It was an invitation that would reshape the future of known space in ways no one could yet predict. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never underestimate humans again.